Oh, good morning, everybody. It's so good to see all of you here today. I am Janet Boynton. I'm co-chair of the Adult Programs Committee at the First Parish in Lincoln. And for those of you who may not be familiar with our church, the First Parish is affiliated with both the UCC and Unitarian denominations. But over the years, we've become a community of people from many faiths and many beliefs. So everyone is welcome here. Today, we have invited you to join us for this very special retreat. And our guest presenter, Olivia Hoblitzelle, brings a wealth of her wisdom and her experience. She was a pioneer in the integration of meditation, yoga, and cognitive therapy with Western medicine. And she trained health professionals under the auspices of the Harvard Medical School. In 2008, Olivia wrote her own very honest and courageous story, 10,000 Joys and 10,000 Sorrows. It's a journey, a couple's journey through Alzheimer's.
Ooh, wow.
It became a best-selling book and won many awards and was translated into many languages. Her most recent book is Aging with Wisdom, which is the foundation of our retreat today. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Olivia Hoblitzelle.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you. What a pleasure to be with you all this morning. And as the computers were sort of booting up, they kept showing glimpses of you all. I don't know how they chose to do that, but it was wonderful because I feel as though I've already connected with some of you. And I was also delighted when Janet showed me the list of who is registered this morning, because to my delight, there's some of my old friends among us. And I would like to be able to greet you, but everybody individually, but that's not quite possible. But anyways, another welcome to those of you who are watching at the conference in Lincoln. So we're quite an assortment of people. Now, in these really strange and troubling times of the pandemic, you know, it's really a gift that we can come together in this virtual way. You know, I think all of us are constantly adjusting to these challenges, but what we're doing is really creating community for the morning. And it's my hope that our time together will be an interlude for you, a time for reflection, for maybe some new perspectives, hopefully some inspiration. So to give you the order of things, we're going to start with a slideshow. And I have to confess my deep, what should I say, love of this slideshow, because I put a lot into creating it. And I felt such a strong call to write about the book, to write the book, Aging with Wisdom, and then to present it through images. And when I started, I thought, how am I going to do this? And my son, I was over the summer a couple of years ago, my son teased me about how long I was spending on the internet looking for images. But I want up front to give credit because most of the images are either mine or Vermont's probably most celebrated photographer named Ethan Hubbard, and also Peter Forbes. I just want to give tribute to creative gifts where they're due. So that's, and then some are off the internet. So that's what creates this PowerPoint. And it's a way of presenting some of the most important topics that we'll be looking at this morning. And so for me, I think somebody needs to mute their speaker. Anyways,
and followed him.
this was really
And
an
came back
intriguing.
every time. He was very indignant that I thought he was lost.
Okay, somebody needs to mute their speaker down in the lower left-hand corner. So
I've
much
muted
technology.
it, and thank you. Apologies. We'll get to the mute button in just a moment.
Oh, okay, okay.
Continue,
I'm
Olivia.
almost done, Sarah.
No problem.
So just to give you a feeling for the morning, we'll start with the slides, then we'll have a brief break, and then we'll have an interlude of meditation, which I will give guidance for, and then a talk, and then the breakout groups. And we'll guide you through each of these steps. And then finally, we'll all come together for the Q&A and discussion at the end. So now, Sarah, over to you. And this is the place where all of you have to pray with me that we get, because I've never done the slideshow on Zoom before. So this is a first. And I think we're all in this together. So Sarah, up to you. Now we're launching into this slideshow. Hold on a second. Just the image for the cover, Aging with Wisdom, Reflections, Stories, and Teachings. And so, as I said earlier, this is really a way of presenting some of the key topics here. Now, you might ask, where does this interest, I should say, almost a passion for talking about aging come from? I really think it starts with my maternal grandmother, who is Danish. She immigrated from Denmark at age 19. And here she is, and I'm sitting with her, I'm 7. And she was beloved to me. And she was one of those wonderful elders who looked at me and held me with unconditional love. And I am sure that that kind of unconditional loving as a child planted the seed that old people are wonderful, and of course a deep connection to her. And so that's where I think this all started. And I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of who I am so you know who's speaking to you this morning. So here I am as a young mother with my husband Harrison Hoblitzelle, who you will be hearing about as part of this discussion, our son Ethan and Laura when they were little. And then I jumped 30 years and I'm now a grandmother. My daughter's on the left and my son-in-law on the right, and my 4 grandsons. And lots of testosterone, lots of male energy. Even the dog is male. So that's the next stage of life. This is to tell you that my work, my career has been teaching, first in psychology, then in behavioral medicine or mind-body medicine, and then finally as a Dharma teacher, teaching Buddhist psychology and meditation. And it's just been my privilege really to meet many people this way. Now here's Hob. The reason I'm introducing him is that he was tentatively diagnosed with Alzheimer's when he was 70 and I was 56. We had a 14-year age difference, and that really catapulted me into the caregiving role at a much younger age than many of my contemporaries. And I should say about him that he was a great explorer of consciousness. And he had a very committed meditation practice. He did a number of 3-month silent retreats, very intense practice, and was ordained a senior teacher by Thich Nhat Hanh. And I mention this because it was without question the combination of our being psychotherapists and meditation practice that were really our greatest allies in getting through the tremendous challenges of Alzheimer's. So moving on, that led me to write this book, 10,000 Joys and 10,000 Sorrows. And in turn, that led to a lot of talks and workshops and conferences talking about this book, talking about how to live with dementia, how to deal with a mind that is gradually going. And so it just deepened my interest in this topic and led me to start writing about aging with wisdom. And the book has 4 sections: reflections, stories, and mysteries. Wisdom treasures. I'll be going into this more deeply. Passages, dying into life. Of course, we need to look at death and dying. And then the 4th section is about way showers. All of this I will explain in more detail. Now, I want to start with a cultural statement, challenging the ageist paradigm. I'm sure that every one of you knows and has experienced ageism. It's there in very subtle ways, maybe as subtly as how some medical professional talks to you, talks down to you in some way, or some way in which you notice that young people sometimes look away from you. I don't need to go on, but just to say this is really a pervasive problem. To explain it, at least the way I do, I think it's rooted in deep fears of aging, of death. And anything that is ignored or repressed in a culture goes into the shadow. And the shadow of this culture is ageism. And I just know, I feel it so deeply, the kind of subtle pain that can cause. Now, I can't find the arrow here. Here we are. Here's an example. We're not old, we're recycled teenagers. Well, I'm sorry, that's not my idea of a good time. I actually had a happy teenage years, but I don't want to go back there, but look at the denial that's in that statement. So I would much rather this, a sign I saw on the island of Molokai: things get better with age, and I'm approaching magnificent. Don't you like that one? It's mine. I'd rather go for that. So I want to speak very briefly about cross-cultural dimensions of this topic. And that comes to me, or came to me most vividly, through a friend that I met actually only about 6 years ago. And this man, David, was a retired Delta Airlines pilot. And his wife, Narina, developed dementia. And they decided that the wisest thing that they could do was to move to Cambodia, to Phnom Penh, where their only child, their son, their adult son, lived. And the first time I met him, David began talking to me about their life in Cambodia. And he said there were 5 years until Narina's death. And he said, those were the happiest years of our lives. I said, David, I said, could you say more about that? It was such a startling statement. And he said, yes, he said it had everything to do with the Cambodian culture. He went on and explained how they were welcomed into their community, how the neighbors helped them to move in, how people greeted him in the street. Of course, he was tall and he had white hair, so he was very striking. But he said, to give you an example, we'd go to a restaurant and people by then knew that Narina was struggling with dementia. And before I'd done anything, he said, somebody would be beside her, helping her, showing her where her fork was or helping her to eat. And he said, that made all the difference. So here's a picture of Narina, and she's at her, I think wherever she went to get her hair cut or a spa or something. But just notice how these lovely Cambodian women are touching her and how you feel almost through this photograph, the ways in which they were embraced by that culture. So very different. In Asian cultures and indigenous cultures, elders are revered. They are turned to in the Native American tradition as leaders of the tribe. And even in some tribes, the women choose the leaders. So we have some very different cultural models around. And it fills me with a kind of sadness that in this country, it's as though somewhere in the national psyche, there's an almost arrested development, as though somehow we're stuck almost in an adolescent dream about life. I know generalizations are risky. Anyways, to move on, here is a favorite topic. It's seeing beauty in old age. And the following images are drawn very much from Ethan Hubbard's book called Wisdom, I think it's something like Wisdom Faces from Around the World. He went around the world with a backpack, taking and photographing elders, older people. It's a beautiful book. And I just went through it and I chose some of these images. So I would invite you to look at them and let them just speak to you. And just notice whatever is conveyed through these different photographs. You see a kind of radiance of the life force of the spirit. This is a woman, I think, kneading or preparing a meal. I think she's Guatemalan. This is a Chinese woman who I think is approaching 100 or maybe over 100. And look what a wonderful weathered face. A face with lines shows a life fully lived. It's like a map of the life that this person has lived. And there's great beauty in that. This is Lily Hurst from another book of images of older people. She's 104 in this picture. And she was a musician and she played the piano every day. That was her great love. And you feel the depth, the warmth of somebody again who's lived a very rich, full life. A Japanese woman, I love this picture, somehow conveying simplicity, maybe something we all long for more of, and just the rake against the side of the house. Now, pay attention to these hands because this is the beginning of a story that I will come back to later. These hands belong to a man named Bill Copperthwaite. He was a Renaissance man. It could be that some of you might have even known him or heard of him. He was in the tradition of Scott and Helen Nearing, the back to the land people who chose to live simply and to live a handmade life, to make as much as they could. He was also an architect, and he was almost most famous for being a designer and builder of yurts. And I love that he even built a yurt in what was previously the Radcliffe Yard at Harvard. And he lived in that yurt as a graduate student. And he didn't have to pay room and board. So I don't know, that just strikes me as marvelous. Anyways, later on in his life, he built his own home, which was a large yurt in Machiasport, Maine. And this is important. Please remember that this yurt was at the end of a 2-mile path. There was no car, there was no road into his house. And this is going to be very relevant later on when I come back to his story. So again, moving on, I keep losing the arrow down here.
Just move your mouse around and they will appear again.
Oh, there it is. Yes, thank you. Another beautiful face. This woman's blind, and yet there's still this radiance of the life spirit. I love this picture. I know Helen, who's on the right. Helen actually is the wife of Peter, the photographer, and they have retreats here in the valley. I'm in Vermont right now, and we need this picture. We need this kind of image of the beauty of people of different races meeting in love. Another Vermont couple, obviously enjoying life. I mean, look at that. What beauty comes through those faces. This is Joanna Macy. Some of you may know her work. I've also the joy of knowing her. She's a Buddhist teacher, an environmentalist, someone who has written many books and has particularly been on a campaign against nuclear energy because there, of course, what happens to the rods is such a controversial subject. Anyways, I saw this picture of her and I thought, here's this beautiful face. I just last weekend heard her speaking. She's 90 now, that she wasn't here. And again, to say the lines in our face are beautiful. And yet we live in a culture that's trying to hide the aging process, trying to Botox a face or cover the wrinkles. But look how beautiful this is. Here's a square dance in Vermont, a wonderful picture. So we should keep dancing. And this is the mother of the photographer, a grandmother with her grandson, and just walking into life. You can see it with such engagement, such joy. This is my unknown elder. I don't know where this picture came from, but it floated around my desk. I got it laminated. I think she's Tibetan. And the reason it speaks to me is that her hands are in namaste, that ancient greeting. And she's looking at us with such compassion and love. Now, moving on, I want to talk about the subject of conscious aging. And as I see it, it's of change. It's living with awareness toward all things. That's actually a profound statement if you really attempt to live with that kind of level of awareness. Openness to the unknown. This is a key one. Awakening to our deepest nature through meditation, faith, or any contemplative practices that nurture our inner resilience. I will be coming back to these themes, but this is a key one. And finally, acceptance of our mortality. Now moving on, what is next here? Wisdom treasures. What are wisdom treasures? Well, I've always been a gatherer of quotations or anything, images, anything that is a source of inspiration. And I'm just going to share two of them. The book has about 14 of them, and I'm going to share two of my favorites. The first one comes from Teilhard de Chardin, the French priest, mystic, author, archaeologist, an extraordinary man. And he wrote these words. He wrote, "In my younger years, I thanked God for my expanding, growing life. But now, in my later years, when I find my physical powers growing less, I thank God also for what I call the grace of diminishment." I'm going to read that again. "In my younger years, I thanked God for my expanding, growing life. But now, in my later years, when I find my physical powers growing less, I thank God also for what I call the grace of diminishment." The grace of diminishment. I heard this, my friend Mary McClellan, who was living with cancer, read this, came to her in a letter. I was about 40 at the time. And I knew how important this phrase was. And I went home and I started a file, and it was called Aging and Wisdom. And little did I know what a theme that would become in my own life. And the main point here is, how can we find grace even in what is most difficult, our diminishment? And so I will say more about that later. This is Teilhard de Chardin. And then going on to a second one, a second wisdom treasure. This one came from a beloved friend of mine who had finally lost her vision. And I had a phase of my life where I lived in California. And when I went out to see her and visit friends, the last time I went, she was totally blind. And because I was very close to her, I was able to ask her, so Blanche, how is it for you now? How are you managing now that your vision is gone? And I will never forget, here's a picture of her. She was a very petite woman, very strong, fiery energy, but very calm. And she tipped her head as she was thinking, and she said these words: I try to treat every moment as new experience. I try to treat every moment as new experience. Well, again, that is a profound statement if one were to live that way. So moving on, this is another section, or this is another topic, I should say, that I think is, if there's any thesis to the book or to the way I see this stage of life, it's this one. I think perhaps, and perhaps you've noticed this yourself, an increased sense of wonder about life. Perhaps also a sense of the mystery in which we live, and also maybe for some of you, the call, the deeper call to our inner life. So now the question was, how in the world was I going to portray this? I'm going to go back. How in the world do you portray wonder or mystery or the call of the inner life? I thought I must do this. And so I'm doing it through seeing beauty in nature, through light, through sacred architecture, through the images of eminent spiritual teachers. So here we are, moving on. I'm sorry. You might ask, what in the world is this image? It is someone's image of consciousness, pure consciousness. And this is a very abstract term, but it's because of this essence of our very being that allows us to see, hear, touch, smell through the senses. That is the source of our knowing. That is, according to the Asian wisdom traditions, the part of us that never dies. The part of us that never dies. Again, according to Eastern wisdom traditions, where the belief in reincarnation is totally accepted, this, I'll say a little more about that, but this is a picture of consciousness. Now, this is a very arresting image. It's in a sense, taking the former image and putting it into slightly more form. At the center is the light of consciousness, the light that is at the core of our very being. And all these spirals, for me, indicate the unfolding of the soul. Spirals are symbolic of the unfolding of consciousness or of the soul. And I think that's what this image is portraying. Now, here is light coming through a tree. And you know how transported you often are by seeing light, a sunrise, a sunset, another picture of light coming through the trees. And here I put this in because the rose in the Christian tradition is symbolic of the opening, the unfolding of the soul. And so it felt important to acknowledge that its beauty, its fragrance, its unfolding are all symbolic of that process. Now here's a sacred place. This is Assisi in Italy, where St. Francis lived. And because a friend of mine took this photograph, it's in the mist and the fog. It seemed to portray the mystery of a sacred place. And similarly, this is the tour in Glastonbury in England. Another sacred place, another power point on our Earth's surface. And maybe some of you have even been to Glastonbury. I have. And there's something, here it is, the ruins of the Abbey, of course, destroyed by Henry VIII. And yet when you go here, when you are here, you cannot destroy the sacredness of a place. And it's really interesting because people tend to walk quietly, talk quietly, and it's because you feel the hush of the sacred. This is Aix-la-Chapelle, I think that's right. It's a cathedral in France, in Paris. I felt there should be a Gothic cathedral with Gothic arches, again, symbolizing the aspiration of the spirit for something beyond our limited sense of ourselves. We all know what this is. It's sometimes deep longing that for something more, for something mysterious. A mosque, just because it's important to represent as many traditions as we can. This is from the Islam, from the Sufi tradition. And here are some pictures of people in worship. A woman, this is obviously Buddhist, praying in front of her altar. And an Hasidic Jew at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. A very compelling picture to me. As I understand it, this is where people put prayers into the crevices in the wall. And this picture, I show this man in meditation out in nature. For those of you who are meditators and sometimes fall asleep, I recommend, I don't really, but I think sitting in a place like this, if you can see, is a drop off here. And that would certainly keep you from falling asleep. So that's one way to do it. Another is just to take a few deep breaths. This is Helen again, another contemplative practice, which is journaling. You can sense the sort of reflective mood she's in. Or another friend of mine doing mindful walking in a field. And this is Rabbi Abraham Heschel, one of the greatest Jewish mystics of the 20th century. And I love this picture. Belongs to a friend of mine, and she let me have it. It lived on our back shelf for several months, actually, so I could take a picture of it. And just looking at this face, I get such a sense of deep compassion. And he said, my faith is to live in radical amazement. That's what he said. I live in radical amazement. And he was also a social activist, and he walked with Martin Luther King. And he said after that, what a powerful experience it had been. And he said, I felt as though my legs were praying. How beautiful is that? This is an Inuit woman praying outside, the light, the sunlight on her face. This is a beautiful, beautiful picture of Jesus. It was painted by the 19th century artist Heinrich Himmler. And to me, I've seen many pictures, of course, painted so often, but this too somehow captures the deep interiority, the mystery of who he really was. This great being with these healing, compassionate, loving powers. And then a Buddha, this is trying to get across a multi-faith approach to this topic. you can see how enormous this figure is as you look at this figure down here. These Buddhas sometimes are huge like that. Again, conveying a kind of depth and serenity. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one of the great beings walking this planet. And another really remarkable photograph of him. The photographer was allowed into his house and even into his sanctuary. And this shows him in meditation. To me, a very moving picture. And I have to say that Hob had the great privilege of spending half an hour there in Dharamsala with His Holiness, who gave Hob a little Buddha, and he put it first on his own crown chakra, and then he put it on Hob's crown chakra as a blessing. What a blessing. And this woman I mentioned, because we have to have a woman teacher here, Khandro Rinpoche, one of Hob's caregivers in the last year of his life, really wanted us to meet her because she is a reincarnated tulku. That's a whole story in itself. But we went to see her and had a most extraordinary meeting, because by then Hob was in the late middle stages of Alzheimer's, and words were rather tricky to come by. She met him in a way that was so beautiful, so extraordinary. And little did we know that a week later, he would have the massive stroke that led to his death. So being with her turned out to be such a blessing. And then after he died, about 2 years afterwards, I went on a pilgrimage. This is how I wanted to honor our lives together. And I had always wanted to go to Tibet. And so this nun, who was in her late 90s, was the keeper of a cave. And this cave was famous for having been practiced in by several of the most renowned spiritual teachers in the Tibetan tradition. And she considered this the greatest of honors, that it was a place of pilgrimage, that she was the keeper, the one who tended the cave. And when our guide came to her, he asked her how long she'd lived there. And she said, I think she said, I've lived here for 10 years or 14 years. And then he said, and how long do you plan to stay? And she just beamed. And she said, well, of course, until I die. Well, such a beautiful story. Different culture, but very inspiring. Now, here's the third topic, dying into life. It's a section in the book. And again, very tricky how to portray this. So even a flower in death, it has a kind of beauty to it. And so I just hope you could be open to these images and let them speak to you however they will. Now, as part of this pilgrimage, oh no, I wanted to acknowledge something here. This is a picture again from that book I referred to. I have to acknowledge, we don't need to, that old age, the elder years can be brutal and heartbreaking. And somehow this woman with her grandson portrays that, a kind of sadness with how difficult it can be. And it's a matter of how do we meet the great challenges that come to us. This picture, very moving. Obviously, this man had been pushed across the sand where he could sit at the edge of the sea, look out to sea, perhaps being reminded of something vast and beyond all the limitations that he was dealing with. Oh my, forgotten this is where we are. Oh, all right. This is a very amazing image because it's someone's depiction of what it is like, what the moment of death is like. It is known from the quite extensive literature from people who've had near-death experiences that this is what one experiences, and you've probably read about it or heard about it, that you feel as though you're moving through a tunnel into this light, into this radiant, clear light. And again, referring to the Tibetan tradition, that tradition more than any other knows the territory of death and dying. If any of you are interested, there is a classic book by Sogyal Rinpoche called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. It's a masterpiece. And it talks about the stages of dying. It talks about preparing for dying. And well, I could tell many stories about this, but I just want you to have this image in mind. Now, when I went on this pilgrimage to Tibet, we started out in Kathmandu. The first morning we went to a temple, and part of the temple was a crematorium. And all of that happened outside and was simply a statement about how much death is woven into life in all these countries. I saw it in India too, where I was fortunate to go, where you're aware of death. You see families caring for their deceased one. And here, this group of people is carrying the body wrapped in orange, which is the color of radiation, down these steps, because down here is the river. And water is considered sacred in Asian countries. And so they are taking the body to be anointed with water. And here we go again. Where's this arrow? Oh, hold on, here's another picture. Now, this is a few moments later, where the body is being burned on a cremation pyre. And you can see people standing around. It's not all hidden away the way it is in this country. And it's a startling thing to see for the first time. And if any of you have ever been to India or gone to Varanasi, the burning ghats are there very much a part of life. And I think that the good thing about this is that death is seen as part of life. So now we're back to the story of Bill Copperthwaite. What happened was, a few days before Thanksgiving, he was on the way to visit friends, and his car hit black ice, went off the road into a tree, and he was killed instantly. Now, because he was a mentor for so many people, because he was, in a sense, the leader of a community, because he had been very clear about how he wanted to be handled in his death, his friends knew, and Peter Forbes, the photographer, was one of them. They knew what he wanted. So they gathered instantly and they went to claim his body, and they built a coffin, a wooden coffin. And here it is, stashed between two canoes, because the only way they could get the coffin to his house, remember there was no road, was to go by way of sea. And I think this is the most astonishing photograph, because it's water, it's still water, and yet it looks almost like sky or space. And I love that it takes our kind of senses and expands them. It's really quite extraordinary. Now here is a few hours later, because they had to paddle the canoes out around a point and come into Dickinson's Reach. And here you can see the weather has changed and the wind has come up. And here they are coming into to the beach. And the other people are waiting, his friends, where they have dug the grave. And they had a spontaneous service there, right? All of this being done by family and friends. And then they had a formal service later on. Now here are other ways to acknowledge a passing. This is a roadside altar. This is just because we need a little, we need a little humor in the midst of all of this. Oh, that's a topic I'll come back to, by the way. Now I'm moving on to the last topic here. It's the topic of way showers. And I don't know where that word came from. I really don't. I don't think I coined it because, you know, there's nothing new under the sun, but I love this word. Why? Well, I think we need way showers for how we age, how we approach the last chapter of life. By the way, and I'll say this more than once, I think the last chapter of life is the most heroic. Why? Because, well, we face the biggest challenges of our life, and we are, I think, called to our greatness in meeting those challenges. So I have the profiles of people who have been way showers for me. And I'm only going to say one word about each of them because otherwise I'll be too long. This Native American mother to my friend Lorraine, a full Blackfoot and Cree Native American Indian. I met her, it's too long a story, but yes, I will. Her life, her hard life, 4 marriages, abusive husbands, alcoholism that they had, abuse, was almost redeemed when she was called into the center of the Sundance. That's the annual gathering of the tribes. And because she was an elder, she was to be the officiant. And they guided her through all the things that she was to do. She was honored. And I saw her just a few weeks later, and she was radiant from this experience. This is Maud Morgan. It could be that some of you knew Maud. She was a famous artist. At age 77, she fulfilled her dream. She'd always wanted to go to Africa. So she took off by herself to Africa with no agenda, no itinerary, with lots of names, contacts, I gather, and traveled Africa alone at age 77. I would say her courage was extraordinary. This is a beloved friend, a Dharma brother named Emerson Stamps, the grandson of a slave. Emerson is the only person I know. I interviewed him. He was in our little meditation group for 14 years. He's the only person I know who remembers before he was born. Yes, take that in. I could talk about it, but it's the only person I know. But he said, I was given an assignment to bring love into this abusive family. And so I call my profile of Emerson, Brought Here by Love. This is Alice Howell, an internationally known Jungian astrologer, a beloved friend. She was merry, she was wise, she was playful. She was surely a mentor, brilliant astrologer, a mentor to me. This is a Polythere Star. Some of you may have known her or know her daughter, Dinah. She too was a great artist. And I got to know her. I met her when she was 97. I went to the elder community where she was, where my father and stepmother were. They wanted me to meet her. And she leaned, we had dinner. She leaned over to me and she said, sort of sotto voce under her voice, she said, I live in this community. She said, I'm really interested in the subject of death and dying. She said, but people here don't want to talk about it. And I said, well, I'll talk about it. I've done hospice work. It's a topic of deep interest to me. And so I came to know her at age 97. I went to see her almost every month. We talked, she had a deep inner life. She was a Quaker. Anyways, here I'm saying too much. Father Bede Griffiths, one of my husband Hobbs' primary teachers. I feel I'm going to come back to him. But anyway, an extraordinary man, a Benedictine monk, British, who went to India in his 40s to discover, as he put it, the other half of my soul. So final reflections. I love this picture. This is my brother and his wife. My brother has since died. They're in their wheelchair at their elder community in Stowe, Vermont. the love that can hold everything. Now, these last images are, they're like a prayer, I think, or a blessing of, it seems to me, the qualities that we perhaps long for in later life. This is a picture of our valley here in Vermont, of a pond. And it's a picture to me of serenity, of calm, that kind of serenity of heart, of equanimity that we all long for. I think somewhere within we all long for a kind of inner freedom. And this to me is a picture of freedom, the girls running after their horse. This also is a picture of freedom. Birds, I think these might be frigate birds. And again, the light here that represents the consciousness that is who we are. Birds represent, in a way, messengers between heaven and earth, and they often appear around dying people. I meant to talk about this woman before I showed her. This is Ani Palmo. And you might say, why do I bring her in here? Well, she is a Tibetan nun. She was incarcerated, imprisoned by the Chinese, and she was in prison for 20 years. She was tortured. She ordained in prison because the Tibetans had a whole secret world that they hid from the guards. And she went through this harrowing experience. And this is a picture taken right after she came out. And she said, our greatest fear was not of the torture, was not of dying. It was that we might lose compassion for our jailers, for the people who watched over us. I think she's an example of a kind of inner resilience. Inner resilience. That's what we hope for. And then just a few final images. I feel this is kind of a luminous flower. I don't quite know what it is, but again, a reminder that the essence of who we are is consciousness. I'll come back to this when I give a talk. Again, a mandala. Well, it's not again, but mandalas are images of psychological and spiritual wholeness. And they appeal to us because they have this kind of, well, this integrated wholeness, such beauty. This amazing image is of a stained glass window in a church, I think it's in Belgium. And in the middle, if you see this here, is the tetragrammaton, which are the Hebrew letters for God, Yahweh. And I found it such an inspiring image, not just because it's a mandala, a rose window, but because it combines Hebrew letters with a Christian symbol. Finally, almost finally, another image from India, again with the light at the center, the sense you can feel your energy, your attention drawn into the center here. And then finally, the cosmos. This is to remind us that there's always a larger perspective. And it's such an important theme. I'll come back to this. But you know, the what are they called? Cosmologists, is that the right word? Tell us that we are made partly from what came in the Big Bang, that we have stardust, so to speak, in our very bones. And to me, that's such a beautiful image of how we connect with something so far beyond us. And of course, just ending with the sunset, because I suppose you could say we're in some ways in the sunset of our lives. And of course, look at the beauty, the light, the color, the variegation. I think it's a beautiful symbol to end with. So I thank you for your attention. That is the end of the slideshow. And we will now have, I think, a 5-minute break, if I can look at our schedule. And I think I have a slide to leave on here. Hold on one second. Yes, Janet asked me to do this. It just has my website, my Facebook page, which I do not handle, by the way. I have no idea how to do that, but my assistant does. My 2 books and some upcoming events in case you're interested. So this is a bio break to use the bathroom, to get a drink of water, whatever you need. And I think it's just 5 minutes. So do come back because we'll move into the next phase of things.
Olivia,
Yes.
you can click stop share now.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
So what do they see at this point?
They'll be seeing you, and they can scroll through if they want to go back to
Because
the
I'm going to start in about a minute because I think we're a few minutes off schedule, but that's all right.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Okay. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you're all back. So I'd like to make a few introductory reflections because this is where we'll have an interlude of meditation. And just to reiterate how it's not true for all by any matter of means, but many of us are drawn to deepen, I think, of our inner life. And I love a story that I heard recently about Suzuki Roshi, who was one of the first Japanese Zen masters to come to the West. He wrote Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And apparently someone asked him, why do we meditate? And apparently he said, so you can enjoy your old age. And then he broke out laughing. And I love that. It's really that apparently he'd been ill all winter. It was near the end of his life, but he still radiated a kind of contentment and a joy. Well, he was speaking to that particular person because the reason for a meditative practice actually go far beyond that. It's really through meditation, to awaken to our deepest nature, to our core self, to called by many names, Buddha nature, the Christ consciousness within, the light within. All these are ways of pointing to the deep mystery of who we really are. And also through meditation, we begin to discover a freedom beyond this limited sense of ourselves. We begin to notice how the mind creates suffering, and how also the mind creates the end of suffering, creates our joy, creates our contentment. Because a lot of the time, and I know you know this, our mind is just filled with concepts and beliefs and opinions, and it's kind of like the T called constant comment. It's always talking, and especially that's hard in the middle of the night when you can't sleep. And yet I think we sense that there's something beyond this, that there is really a kind of non-dual consciousness. It's experienced in moments, perhaps when you've had a peak experience, watching a beautiful sunset or being in nature or something like this. There's sort of intimations of our oneness with all things, a kind of oneness that's beyond our sense of separation from others. And all of this can be what the meditative process begins to unfold within. So I just want to say personally, as a longtime meditator, I've always been intrigued by this possibility for awakening, for liberation, for enlightenment, and how we attain that ultimate wholeness, that ultimate freedom, which I think all of us feel intimations of. I think we all feel that. In any case, it may be unconscious, but it's there. So our culture isn't very interested in this, but it's an extroverted, secular, materialistic culture. So people who have deep contemplative lives are kind of looked upon as rather different. But, monks, nuns, anyways, better not go into that one. But I think what I'd just like to emphasize the importance of having some form of contemplative practice so that we can meet the challenges of our aging. So I just want to say before I give you some guidance into meditation, that we give the mind a focus. I know a lot of you know this. We use the breath, which is the most universal focus. And it's a process of giving our full attention to the moment, this moment, the next moment. And as concentration deepens, the body relaxes, thoughts are less intrusive, the moments of calm increase. And so I invite you now to get into a comfortable sitting posture where I'm now giving you the guidance, which will help hopefully. Let your back be straight. And begin by taking 3 or 4 longer, deeper breaths. And let the thinking mind drop into the feeling body. Bring full awareness to the body. Just sitting. Feeling the weight of your sitting bones on the chair or the cushion. Aware of your feet, if they're on the floor. Aware of your hands. Bring full attention to your hands. Their warmth, perhaps tingling, perhaps the pulse of blood flowing. And then awareness to your upper back and neck, where we tend to carry tension. And just invite the body to let go with each out breath. Let go. Let all the facial muscles go. Feel the softness coming into the face. And then bring your attention back to your breath. Bring awareness to the breath coming into the body, flowing out. It's natural for thoughts to arise. Just notice that and bring attention back to the next breath. And so as we move into silence, just remember to keep returning to the breath. And I'll sound a gong at the end. So for the last couple of minutes, be with each breath. Breath is life. And so gently bring your attention back to the room. Maybe staying in touch with your breath. So welcome, an interlude of turning within and getting quiet. Hopefully the body relaxing some, and the mind maybe quieting a little bit. Maybe it got busier. That often happens too. Wish we could talk about meditation, but we're going to move on. And I suggest before I move into some more reflections with you that you might want to just stand up for a moment and just stretch, and then we'll go on from there. Just take a few deep breaths and stretch to right or left or whatever you need to do so you'll be comfortable while I share a few more thoughts with you. Okay, so come back to your seat, and I just would like to take the next phase of our program to flesh out some of the topics that were raised in the slideshow. And I'm reminded of a moment at a conference last year, just before the COVID reality hit us, when the moderator turned to me and said, so what are the 4 or 5 most important points that you talk about on this subject, aging with wisdom? It felt like he almost threw down the gauntlet, because I sort of gulped. I thought, whoa, you want me to do that off the top of my head? Well, I did. And I want to use his question as kind of a way to reflect further with you. And there are sort of 5 subjects that I want to return to, just to give you an idea of a framework. I would like to say more about this term conscious aging. I think I first heard it in my 40s. I was still pretty young then, but something said, that's really important. You're going to want to pay attention to that. And I would say it became almost like a an inner GPS for me, because for some mysterious reason, I was very drawn to keep looking into all the challenges and invitations and gifts that are part of the aging process. It's like, how do we do that consciously? Well, it's partly going back to this issue of our age-phobic culture. It felt particularly important that somehow we claim something so precious about being elders. Something, as I said before, Asian cultures, indigenous cultures take for granted, but we don't. And I want to say once again that I really think it's rooted in fears of aging and fears of death and dying. And of course, that's totally natural, but the turning away from it is not. And so, as I said before, I think the elder years are the most heroic. And I explained that with this diminished energy that we experience, perhaps some of us are dealing with life-threatening illness. It's how we rise to meet these challenges and bring the kind of courage, if you will, and even nobility to this phase of our lives. For I like to say that, of course, aging is in the natural order of things. I don't know where that phrase came from, but I love it because it reminds us that what we're going through is so natural. It's a part of what we're watching nature, our beloved Mother Nature going through right now as the leaves fall and the trees turn bare and the ground freezes and winter comes. And in the same way, that's happening to the body. And so how do we live with awareness and acceptance toward these inevitable changes? And I think this concept of conscious aging is an invitation to live with awareness, as one of those slides said, to bring almost curiosity to what's happening to us, and acceptance. That's a big one, acceptance. And yes, I want to acknowledge that we have our dismay, our distress, our resistance, our anger even at some of the things that we have to tolerate. And that's our humanness. And it's somehow keeping the balance between the reality, the sort of fierce reality of growing older, with the same time cultivating the inner resilience, the calm, the steadiness to meet what comes our way. I mean, it's no tall order, it's a lot. It's a lot to ask. Now, when Hob and I learned that he had this diagnosis, which was a tough one. My mother had gone through Alzheimer's. I'd already been through this trip once. I was like, oh, how are we going to do this? And I'll never forget that conversation when we talked about what we wanted to bring to this experience. And we agreed that if we wanted to live it, whatever was going to happen, as consciously and as lovingly as possible. And that became like maybe another inner GPS. I seem to be with GPS this morning. Anyway, a sort of reference point to come back to when times were hard. And it's helpful to have those kind of markers in your life. So that's a little bit more about conscious aging. Now, I'd like to move to the second topic, which is, and this is really important. How do we have lightness of being? How do we have a sense of humor even towards what we're going through? Now, I want to give you a few more examples from this beloved husband of mine, because he had a wonderful sense of humor. And his credo was that we need to spend a certain amount of time laughing every day. I'm quoting him now. You've got to have a few laughs. That's my contribution to the world. And indeed it was. And another time he said, it's my solemn obligation to be happy. You know, I love that. It's sort of paradoxical. Solemn obligation on the one hand, to be happy on the other. And, you know, it just makes me smile to think of that. And then I'll give you one last bit from him, because that book is full of things that he said, which I would go and write down. He said, I'm always being tricked by things. You know, he'd lose things. I don't know about you, but I lose things. I can't, anyway, you see, I'm being tricked by colors. Anyway, he said, I'm always being tricked by things. Catch on to whatever stick of kindling you can when you're going down with the Titanic. And he burst out laughing. Now, what an image, right? What an image. Whatever stick, catch on to whatever stick of kindling you can when you're going down with the Titanic. That tells you how he felt about what he was going through. It was that enormous, like this great ship going down. It's like what it feels to us, doesn't it? And grab hold of whatever you can. But he was saying the humor, the lightness of being, that's what helps. Now, sometimes he dealt with his losses with this kind of black humor, but he delighted in the ability to make people laugh. Now, I want to mention one other person who I think exemplifies this quite beautifully. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Ram Dass, Baba Ram Dass. At once, the controversial and most beloved former professor who went to India, found a guru, had his life transformed, came back and brought these teachings of Eastern wisdom to the West. And he had an absolutely delicious sense of humor. Well, in his early 80s, he had a massive stroke, and it left him paralyzed and unable to speak, virtually unable to move. And only after, I think, 4 or 5 years of rehab did he start to very slowly regain some speech. I happened to see him, we knew him at that time, and he spoke like this: space between the words. And yet he returned to teaching, and his speech haltingly came back with its many pauses. And listen to what he said. These are his words. This is aging. Wow, it's all new. Ah. Every change in your body, he said, show you how you are attached to the past. I send my love to my painful foot and pay attention to my spiritual practices. My body is like having an old Ford car. The body is your conveyance on this plane, but our souls meet on another plane. So that's some words from him. Wow, that's how he's approaching it. Wow. After a massive stroke, it's really impressive. But it's how we balance the brutal, heartbreaking aspects of aging while cultivating positive attitudes. So that's the second area. Humor and lightness of being. Now, the third one, I realize this is big territory that we're going into this morning. And I hope we're doing it in a benevolent way. But part of our task is really to look at reality straight on, meet it consciously. So the third area that I want to talk about is dealing with loss and the unexpected, because this is the territory we're in. The one I struggle with sometimes is my diminished energy. My study is on the 3rd floor, and I can tell you those 3 flights of stairs, they're different from what they were 20 years ago. There's limited vision, limited hearing, things that continue to ache. I think maybe you can relate to some of this. But again, what perspective or what attitudes do we bring to our losses? Because here's where our power lies. Here's where choice resides. And I want to share with you the example of a beloved friend of mine, because I think it's helpful to have these way showers, these people who have gone ahead of us and shown us how to do it. And I love the idea of having mentors for aging. And you know, the kind of paradox here is that we're now mentors to the young, and yet we still need our mentors. And this beloved friend, his name was Leonard, and I met him in a spiritual community that we shared for many years, both in this country and in India, where I went to be in an ashram. This was one phase of my spiritual journey. And Leonard was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy in his teenage years. And by the time he was in his 20s, he was in a wheelchair. And I met him in his 40s. At that time, he could only move his arms and the muscles of his face. Now, he was one of the most beloved people in this community. He was there in his wheelchair. He was like a magnet. And what was it? It was his total acceptance of his physical fate, if you will. He had this light and loving presence. And wherever he went, children clustered around his wheelchair. It was as though something in his presence just magnetized people to him. And one of the memorable times in my life was when we went on a pilgrimage. This was in India, a 5-day pilgrimage, 4 of us, Mahadev and his attendant, my daughter and me. And we had to lift his inert body onto buses and off buses. His attendant had to push his wheelchair over rutted paths and lift it over the thresholds of temples. And all through this, of course, he was an object of great interest there, but it was this presence that he had that drew people to him. And it was his total acceptance of loss. And I would add that perhaps one of the greatest gifts that we bring as elders is the gift of our presence. What do people experience when they're with us? Now, what about dealing with the unexpected? It's such an inevitable part of this process of aging. And I know every one of us has had those moments when the unexpected came up. The wisdom teachings invite us to have what is known as don't know mind. And oh boy, that can be a big one for all of us who are so identified with our minds. And I know that many of us here are like that. I sure am. But the wisdom teachings are saying there's something beyond the mind. I'll say more about that in a minute. Just think about, I love some of these book titles that point to this. Krishnamurti, the great Indian sage, he wrote a book called Freedom from the Known. freedom from the known. There is freedom beyond the mind. Or one of my favorite authors is Pema Chodron. Her book titles tell us a lot. When Things Fall Apart is one of them. Start Where You Are is another one. The Wisdom of No Escape. I just put these out as sort of examples of what we deal with. And finally, I just heard this recently, the words of Mary Oliver, our beloved poet, Mary Oliver. She said simply, keep space in your heart for the unimaginable. Keep space in your heart for the unimaginable. What wisdom, what beautiful words. So, turning to the fourth area, this is what I've been referring to, the call to the inner life, which some of you may have felt, some of you may not, and how invaluable it is to have some kind of a contemplative practice. So here's a question. What do you turn to in the most challenging moments, the most difficult times? Do you know what your refuges are? This is really an important question. We need somewhere to turn. You know, it can be as simple as the breath, deeper breaths, that's time honored. It can be a short prayer or a mantra. Lord have mercy. It can be whatever works for you, but what is it? We need something, some kind of regular practice that we turn to regularly. Now, there are many spiritual practices, and I'm sure some of you do these like hatha yoga, like Tai Chi, Qigong. They're invaluable forms of training. But at some point, our body won't be able to do these things. And then what do you turn to? Now, just a few observations about the meditative process, whether it's sitting quietly or it's awareness in movement. It's a process of discovering the true nature of the mind. It's the process of bringing awareness to whatever arises. And it's beginning to see how the mind creates both joy and suffering. And as the famous Four Noble Truths in Buddhism say, it's also possible to end suffering. And that is possible through deep exploration of the mind. Now, I want to say something here that another reason that the working with the mind is so valuable is that it slowly but surely starts to lose our fixed identifications with part of who we think we are. Now, I want to say that one of our strongest identifications is obviously with the body. You know, we think we're this body. Well, we are, but we only inhabit it. And so when you get very quiet, and I'm sure many of you know this, you lose the sense of the body. You're simply dwelling in pure awareness. Well, in the same way, we have this hurricane of emotions that can go through at various times, but we're not our emotions. They come and they go. They're not who we are. This one's bigger. We have a mind. It's a beautiful instrument, but we are not our mind. We are something subtler and more profound that is beyond the mind. It is that consciousness. It is that light of awareness. It is that knowing that is beyond conceptual thinking. Now, it's actually pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. It's outrageous, some of you might be saying, that anybody could say, I'm not my mind. Of course I'm my mind. We have a mind, but we are not that. We are something beyond that. And this, of course, points to the mystery of existence. It points to the mystery of who we are. And so I just want to say, go back to those slides of light that I showed you, that there's consciousness beyond the mind. And there's so many stories of near-death experiences, of anesthetized patients who still hear. I have an extraordinary story. Maybe I'll tell it in the Q&A about a doctor friend of mine who had a near-death experience on the operating table. And she was able to hear, her consciousness was out of her body. Well, here I am telling you the story. In any case, I'll just say a little bit more here because it's really, really thought-provoking. So Bettina, she's a physician. She was in childbirth, giving birth to twins when she went into cardiac arrest. And her heart stopped, her vital signs dropped, and all the bells and whistles went off. She was clinically dead. And the cardiologist opened her chest. He put his hands in, he began to palpate her heart. She told him this later. She said, I could feel the love that was pouring into me through your hands. But her consciousness was out of her body, up in the upper sort of corner of the operating room, looking down at what was happening. The next morning, when the cardiologist and the surgeon came in to see her, she's a doctor, got it? She was able to tell him what she heard, what instruments she saw, and how she felt the love coming through his hands, trying to revive her, which he did. I'm sorry, it makes me so moved to tell this story because I got to know Bettina. She told this story at our first conference at Harvard Medical School, training all these professionals from all over the world. And I can tell you that room was very quiet because this pretty well challenges a lot of thinking that we have about what reality is. There are many realities beyond this one. There are many realities beyond this one. And for me, it's a source of deep solace and comfort to know that we are something beyond all these ways that we identify ourselves. Now I'm feeling a little bit humbled, as though I've thrown a really big topic in here this morning, but that's what happened. So the fruits of having a contemplative practice, I think many of you know what those are because you have a practice of some sort, that we begin to notice that we live with more equanimity, more contentment, more inner strength, more resilience, and more fearlessness. I certainly know that I have incalculable great gratitude towards what has been revealed to me after this almost 50 years of practice. And many people will validate this, including many of you. So let me move to the fifth topic, which is, let's see how we're doing on time here. We're doing well. I would like to go back to the subject of death and dying. You know, we've come a long way. I'm sure many of you remember that groundbreaking book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was such a pioneer in this field and talked about the 5 stages of when we get a final diagnosis, the final stages that we go through. I'm sure you remember this, those of you who read her book. But I want to go back to a personal story that when Hob and I learned of his tentative diagnosis, I knew that I needed support and I needed inspiration. And so I went back to one of my spiritual friends or mentors, the term, I love the term in Sanskrit, is Kalyana Mitra. That means spiritual friend. And my spiritual friend, I've been tremendously blessed. One of the first people that I went to when I was looking for an enlightened teacher, that's no small statement, someone named Tulku Thondup. And he, believe it or not, lives in my neighborhood in Cambridge, hidden away. He's in the Buddhist world internationally known as a scholar and a teacher. And so I went to see him. And he gave me, this is in my first book, he gave me some of the most precious guidance that I was to receive throughout the 6 years of Hobbes' journey. It was 6 years from the time he was diagnosed till his death. And at that meeting, I will never forget that Tulku Thondup, TT we call him, said to me, all of our practices, especially meditation, are preparation for death. Now you might say, well, that's a pretty heavy statement. Well, on one level it is, but on another level, it's a tremendous gift. Because when he refers to all our practices, he's talking about conscious awareness. He's talking about how the smallest things in our life are the most precious, really. He told me that, for instance, feeding Hob, of course, we weren't at that stage at all. He said, even giving him a spoonful of food will become part of your practice, because that simple gesture, that loving gesture of helping someone to eat is a gesture of kindness, of gratitude for their presence, of compassion, of love. He said, those are our practices. And so our being together this morning in this way, the way we're bringing listening and presence to each other, these are practices. And that's what he was telling me. He said, all of our practices, our awareness practices, are practices of living consciously. All of our practices, especially meditation, are a preparation for death. Now, I can talk about this for a long time, because anything that we learn to let go of is a preparation for death. Now, I better keep going here. I've gone off on a big tangent, but I want to go back to Rabbi Abraham Heschel. He said, life's ultimate meaning remains obscure unless it is reflected upon in the face of death. Again, life's ultimate meaning remains obscure unless it is reflected upon in the face of death. Now, I want to tell you one last story. It's a signature story in my life, and so I tell it. As some of you have heard it, forgive me, but I need its message. I get its message anew every single time. So it was in the last couple of years of Hobbes' life when he began having TIAs, transient ischemic attacks. Some of you may have experienced this, where he would lose consciousness. And the first time it happened, we were in a neighborhood restaurant, and he fell forward over his plate, and I kept calling, hubby, are you all right? Are you all right? No answer. And it was clear that he had passed out. And so then there was this tremendous flurry. The 911 was called, the restaurant filled with EMTs, emergency medical teams. And the next scene was in the ambulance. And I was in the front where I could turn around and look through a window and see him lying there and hear, because the window was open, the EMTs were yelling at him. Harrison, that was his name. Harrison, can you hear us? They were trying to break through his unconsciousness. By that time, he'd been unconscious for about 20 minutes. And I was quite sure he was dying. Perhaps he'd even died. I didn't know. It was a terrible moment. And then I could see him beginning to stir. And unbelievably, he speaks. And he says, "Will you guys please keep it down? I'm trying to die here." Now, I tell you, I don't know what you think, but I don't think EMTs have ever heard those words before. And yet I knew that that's what Hob was doing, because he and I had had several very important talks about death and dying. He had told me that he didn't want to live into the late stages of the illness. He said, "I'm going to die on my own timetable," and that's what he did. And I knew that in his practice of meditation, he had practiced dying. That in fact, any moment that you let go of a difficult thought, a tough emotion, it's a mini death. It's a mini practicing of letting go, because that's what death is all about. It's letting go. It's the final letting go. It's letting go on the final out breath, because we die on an out breath. But then those EMTs went on yelling at him because, of course, they assumed he was old and deaf. You notice how people sometimes yell at us? "Are you in pain? Are you in pain?" And again, I saw him stir. And then he did what he did over and over again. He quoted something. He quoted something. He quoted a line from an epitaph from a Kurt Vonnegut novel. And he said, "Everything is beautiful and nothing hurts." That was the epitaph. Everything's beautiful and nothing hurts. He was telling them nothing hurts. He answered their question. But at that point in his loss of language, he had the gift of poetry. He remembered. And that's how he told them that he wasn't in pain. This is the message from his near-death experience that night. The next day, he was pretty wiped out. He told me, and listen to his words. "This is Hob speaking to you. I was going to all these places I haven't previously visited. Now that I've died once, I can use that as my guide. This passing out, this dying, it's simple. There's nothing scary here. It's not a big deal. It's just fine. If dying is this easy, no problem." What a gift. He's telling us, and I've heard this, I've read this, had my own near-death experience. He's telling us it's easy. It can be very difficult, but may we all have the grace of a peaceful death. Now, let me conclude here, because I've gone over a little bit. Just to conclude, I've gone over these main topics about conscious aging, about having a sense of humor, a sense of lightness, about dealing with loss and the unexpected, about contemplative practice, and about death and dying. These were the 5 big ones that I came up with when that person asked me. These are the 5 big ones. And I just have to share with you that I just get very inspired talking about this. And I want you to understand, I'm also talking to myself. I'm trying to inspire myself for meeting this time of life with as much sort of openness and curiosity and acceptance as I can. And hopefully I've conveyed a little bit of this to you, that really life is so precious and it's filled with wonder. It's filled with mystery. And I do think as elders, we're invited to open to whole new dimensions of that. That's one of the gifts of aging. Thank you for your attention.